model. It's something that I've worked with quite a bit. I have implemented some large Scrum projects. In the early days of my career, somewhere 2005, did work at BMC Software, 500, 600, 700 people in a project, and I liked those challenges, and I kept working with it. A bit more recently, did a lot of work at Cisco at the Voice Technology Group, and again, very large and very complex projects going on over there. And we did a lot of groundbreaking work on how to handle that. If you like to read up after this webinar, then through Qatar, some of my reports have been published. Complexity at Cisco is one, so you can read up there, or just contact me for some more information. Would be happy to assist you with any questions. My usual work is taking place in the US. I'll be training and consulting there, and sometimes I'll go abroad. I've been traveling a fair bit, also in South America, in Peru, Argentina, Brazil. Have done training over there. Got good friends over there. I've worked in Asia. I've worked in the Middle East. I worked in Europe. So that's what I like to do for both this webinar and the conference, as well for how I work, is to bring that experience. So not so much teaching by the book, but a lot more about teaching by experience. So let's look at that a bit longer. Like I said, the theme for the next 40 minutes is a Scrum at scale, and a project scales pretty quickly. What I'm saying on the slide here is 3 or more teams, and you already have a challenge that those teams need to work together, that you need to synchronize them, you need to communicate between the teams, and what are possible solutions there. That's the topic for today. All of that is based on the Scrum process, and a downside of a webinar is that I cannot really interact with you. I do not know how much you know about the Scrum process. So let's go really quickly through it. Let me not make it a whole class. That would take 2 days. But quickly going through the process and also pointing out some things where you might find some challenges when you're scrumming with more than 3 or 4 teams. Scrum, like any project, starts with a product backlog, a list of things to do, and Scrum, like any agile approach, asks the product people, the folks who really want us to do that project, to deliver a product, to prioritize that list, to tell the developers what's most important, so that the developers can work from the most important features to the ones that are nice to have. That list is dynamic. It can always change. If you're not too familiar with Scrum or with Agile, then you're probably familiar with a waterfall project. A waterfall project starts with a requirements phase, and after that phase, the requirements are pretty much frozen. Not entirely, change is possible, but it's hard. In Scrum, there is no freeze. The requirements can change all the time. What's now an interesting question for Scrum at scale that we will look at later on in the session is, and how can we manage, on the one hand, change and a product owner who wants to change content, but on the other hand, create stability and a continuous delivery, because continuous delivery is continuous value coming out of your software teams, and that's why we're doing all this software development work. Question will be answered later, but that's certainly one challenge in a scaled agile project. With that list, that product backlog, the whole team will do their planning meeting, their what Scrum calls sprint planning meeting. The team, the people doing the work, will look at the list, principal, select work from the top, and decide on how they will deliver those features in the next 2, 3, or 4 weeks. I have a tendency to work with short sprints. 2 weeks is a nice amount of time. You can get substantial work done. You can get really a feature delivered, because that's the goal of the end of a sprint, that we have work completed. Yet the time box is so small that the product owner can change his mind, her mind, and change that product backlog. There's never a long waiting time if something urgent comes up. So sprint planning, the team looks at the product backlog, takes the high priority features, unless there's something that prevents them from doing so, but as a rule they take the high priority work. They agree how they will do the work, and then make a commitment. They make a promise to the product owner and say, yes, this is what we will do. And off they go. For 2 weeks, they will, what Scrum calls, what I was talking about, 2 weeks of delivery time. So we have an increment of the product at the end of the 2 weeks, which we can demo to the customers, to the stakeholders, to the product owner. Product owner might get new ideas which will have an impact on the product backlog, and the team can sit down, do a retrospective, inspect how the work went, and do better in the next 2 weeks. The basic Scrum model. I think that most of you have seen it. So let's move on from here and see what's happening when we start scaling. And when are we scaling? Scrum, in its essence, is very lightweight. It's small. It's what's sometimes called barely sufficient process. There's just enough to keep a project going, but not more. It relies on self-organizing people, self-organizing teams. The framework, which means that in your organization you will have to implement your own structure, your own best way of using Scrum. Not skipping anything. You can't leave sprint planning out, then it's not Scrum anymore. But if you have a distributed team, you may have to run sprint planning with some support of a tool or any other support activities. Starting with scaling Scrum should not change those principles. Scrum at scale should still be light and barely sufficient and a framework. And that is the method that we're now going to look at, is really supporting those ideas. There are some more frameworks around. While here at the conference, I see that large organizations, IBM, HP, they're doing their own thing. The SAFe framework is certainly getting a lot of attention. It occurs to me that it's pretty heavy what is going on over there. Looking at what we in the Scrum Alliance, in the Scrum Trainers community, really like about a lightweight process is the work that was done by Craig Larman and Bas Vodde in scaling Scrum. This is a picture of it, of scaling Scrum to a smaller number of teams, 5, 8, 10 teams. It's definitely a larger project, but not super large yet. The key thing is that it doesn't really change what Scrum is. If we're looking at the picture, what's recognizable, although the drawing is slightly different from mine, is that there is a basic Scrum process with all the components that we just looked at. There is a product backlog, there is a sprint planning session, we're sprinting, we're having daily meetings, we're having an increment at the end. It's all there. We just stack a number of those. And by stacking, yeah, we're keeping it as simple as it was, and as that simple team model was, but we're now doing more work because we multiply the number of teams. That does require some synchronization, absolutely. How is that done in the simplest form? Simplest form is to do that sprint planning part, which was usually a single team, single meeting for a 2-week sprint, probably together for 2 to 3 hours, is by splitting that in two. Let me clean this up a little bit because I'm making a mess here of the drawing. What in this scaled Scrum framework is happening is that sprint planning is split up. There is a part 1 with all the teams involved. And that's why this way of scaling is limited to a maximum of 10 teams, because with 10 teams you probably have already 50, 60 people in the room, and that's getting pretty big and hard to manage. But in that part, the teams, or maybe just a few representatives of every team, decide which item from that product backlog is going to which team. They select work and move that to the most suitable team. In my experience, teams usually have a specialism. They usually have an focus or something that they're really good at. So the teams pick the work that suits them best. Bit of a discussion, what do we do with work that's not so popular or that doesn't have an ideal team that can solve that problem. But in the first part, the stories, the items from the product backlog get distributed over each of the teams. And then in part 2 of sprint planning, we work on a team-by-team basis.
And I'm losing some other technology. Karen, am I a presenter? We do it without it. Looking at this screen again, what I was talking about is that in order to scale Scrum in a way where it's not too big, maximum of probably 10 teams, 8 or 10 teams, due to the sheer number of people, and that could be in several meetings. Sprint planning is split up into 2 sessions. Part 1 could be with all the people in the room, but more likely with the product owner and the Scrum Masters in the meeting, deciding on what work will be done, looking at the product backlog, and in that sprint one planning session, deciding which teammate takes what work. Then in part 2, which is a team-by-team meeting, a team-by-team session, every team decides how to do it, the tasking out that I spoke about earlier. After that, sprinting continues as per usual. The sprint is happening, and at the end, there's as again per usual, a potentially shippable product increment, the standard terminology. What is added in terms of complexity here is that if we have multiple teams, the picture here we have 3 teams working on that single increment that we need to integrate. And Agile Scrum helps us to do that as often as we probably can. Daily would be nice. More than once a day would even be better. So technology-wise or support-wise, you definitely have work to do here to then enable a scaled Scrum framework. Other than that, the teams are just executing a Scrum process. It's just as light. It is exactly the same things. If you desire to do so, you could add one more meeting to it. That daily Scrum is some meeting for each of the teams. You can add what's usually called Scrum of Scrums. We could have 1 or 2 people from each of the teams on a daily basis get together and talk about what did my team do yesterday. The Scrum Masters are very good candidates to participate in that Scrum of Scrum meetings. And it could be other people, it could be more than just the Scrum Masters. Scrum of Scrum, usually abbreviated as an SLS. to keep the communication between the teams going. Then we have a potentially shippable product implement at the end. And again, as per Scrum, we do that review. I prefer to do a review with all of the teams together. We're working on the same product, so let's do a demo, a review with all the teams together. You might not be able to demo each and every component that was developed. You might have to make a selection together with the product owner, but bring it all together. Make sure that the product owner and the stakeholders see the big picture. The retrospectives are, again, on a team-by-team basis. If you want to, you can have a joint retrospective or a Scrum Master retrospective to talk about what happened between the teams. After that, it is, again, Scrum as per usual. If this is the last day of the sprint, the next day, we're back into sprint planning again. So scaling for a larger project up to 10 teams, not all that complicated, still very light, very simple. Don't do a lot more than we're doing in the usual Scrum process. If you go even bigger this, and I now see that my application is quitting again, and I'm not sure whether you can hear me on the phone. Let me check that with Karen. Karen, can you check your Skype if you can hear me? Okay, I see notes that you can hear me, so I'm going to continue. And thank you for keeping me updated there. So where we came from was that simple scaling process. Now we're going a whole lot larger. We're having more than 8 or 10 teams going. We have probably no longer a single product. It's more a product with verticals in it. Think about building software for an insurance company. And you have a bunch of teams, 3, 4, 5 teams working on insurance policies, and you have another 3 teams working on claims, and another 5 teams working on billing. It's all insurance, but it's very different parts of that product. And the one product is represented, is made visible in, we have one product owner, we have one product backlog. There's always one person who's really stakeholder, sponsor, product owner, as Scrum calls it, and he or she wants that whole insurance product to be developed. But there's just too much going on. That one product owner cannot do all the work by himself, and hence we're introducing an additional role, what we call an area product owner. The person who knows a lot about, if I stick with that insurance example, who knows a lot about claims, and the colleague knows a lot about policy, and the third colleague knows a whole lot about billing. We're getting area product owners. The way I think about this is that the product owner, the top level person, is doing portfolio management, decides where is the money going to go. Is it being used for more policy development, or is it used for more claims development? The big picture, that product owner will indicate that a whole new product will be developed. For example, we've always done home insurance and car insurance, and now we're going to also insure rental properties. And thinking big picture, thinking portfolio. The product owners, the area product owners, the 3, will think in more detail. They are the people who really write a product backlog, who write user stories, who will work with the team in backlog refinement, backlog grooming sessions, etc. And basically, we're repeating again that picture from the previous slide, that scaled agile and that scaled Scrum framework. This is that picture from the previous slide, but we're now stacking it again. So we have one of those scaled Scrum frameworks for claims processing, and we have another one for policy, and a one at the bottom for billing. It's just repeating the pattern again. And that's what I like about the what we usually call the less framework, because we're doing more with less process. We're not making it a heavy process like in the safe environment. But we definitely have to add some process. We definitely have to add the role of a product owner or an area product owner. Things will get a bit more complicated. Hey, our whole project is more complicated. I'm going to leave it to this with regards to scaling. We lost a bit of time with all the breaks, and I do want to pay attention to your questions. See if I can still go on, because at my end I still have trouble with the application. We get that going, because this is just one part of a scaling problem. Scaling problem where we have more people and we need to synchronize their plans, their communication. That's what we just spoke about. We're introducing a few more meetings, a few more people, not a whole lot. But what else is there? And I'm working here to get to the next slide. When I work with large projects, like that insurance project, which is one that I really ran with, or when I worked at Cisco with sometimes 30, 40, 50 teams in parallel, and we had to find a way of working where the overall project would get smaller. And here's the model we implemented at Cisco. If you look at what we're doing in Agile, let me step out of the picture for a moment. What is Agile? What is Scrum all about? It's basically cutting up a big project in small steps, in sprints. The thinking behind it has to do with queuing theory. If you're familiar with it, queuing theory says that when you have large batches of work going into your system, you have a low throughput. Think about supermarkets on a Saturday morning when every family in the area is coming into the supermarket. It's basically a disaster. You have long wait times everywhere. It takes hours to get your basic shopping done. Big batches cause a lot of delay, slow throughput. Scrum is making small sprints, small batches, and hence we're going fast with it. How to maintain that momentum in a larger project? That's what this picture is. Rather than planning for a whole insurance project, which is probably going to take us a year or 2 years to develop, if we plan work for just a couple of months, 3-4 months, that planning of that work, that preparing of that work is what nowadays in Scrum is called backlog refinement. It used to be called backlog grooming. What's in the name? It's all the same thing. Because product people prepare based on vision, based on ideas, on what the competition is doing, on what the customers need. They prepare through that refinement process a product backlog. They will have, after a number of days or weeks or maybe even months of work, a product backlog that will create enough work on multiple teams. I could fit only 3 in this picture, but it could be 20, 30, 40 teams. And they create enough work on a product backlog, they prioritize the product backlog, and just enough for 3 months. Cut that huge project up in a smaller batch, a 3-month batch. And then kick off, going back to the previous slide, to slide 8, then we kick off this scaled model. it will also work for the simple scaled model, what we saw 2 slides ago. So kick off a piece of the project, not the whole project, and get your teams going for about 3 months. Why 3 months? Why splitting up? A large project, say you're going to spend a year on that insurance project, in a year some big things will change. Government will have new regulations, the finance industry is developing, your customers might change, you might get some very large or very small customers on board, but there's significant change. Within 3 months, the change is not too big. Change will occur, and you need to pay attention to it, but before you're ready to really launch a new part of the project, your 3 months are up. So preparing work for about 3 months, you see in the picture here, gives the product owners, the stakeholders, your management team, time, the same 3 months, to prepare to run the next refinement session to get ready for the work for the next 3 months. In other words, what I call we plan to replan. We do anticipate that our big 120, 150 people insurance project is just not going to happen without some significant changes happening. Planning to replan. That's what's going on in this model. There is preparation work, there is backlog creation, there is backlog updating going on, while the teams are working pretty undisturbed against the plan that they drew out in a release planning session. We're still agile, change is still possible, but we're creating a fair amount of stability without going overboard like we used to do in waterfall projects. So that is preparing for projects and how to treat a large project, shipping it up into smaller steps, and by using that plan to replan model. Given the time and given the fact that I want to see some more of your questions and answer them, I'm going to stop talking about this topic here. One more slide, which I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to, but I will be doing 2 things at the Agile conference. I will have a longer talk on the topic we just, with all those interrupts, and I'm so sorry about that topic that I just presented, scaling Agile initiatives. I will also be running a half-day workshop on what I call 5 levels of planning, how to work from a big idea, vision, into a really executable sprint plan. So that's on what's going to happen at the conference, and I hope that I will see many of you there, because face-to-face is a lot less interrupted than what we've experienced today with our technology. And I would like to open up this session for questions now. I believe, Karen, that you have been collecting questions and that you'll be firing those at me through our Skype link. So I'm also quickly reading through the notes that I see passing. If you have questions, you could also type them up over there. So what can I help you with? What things do interest you? Did I address a bit too short or a bit too long? I don't know. Please tell me. I see a question, several questions coming in around artifacts and documents. There is and somebody asking to see the last slide. That's multitasking I can manage. I can show the slide but talk about something else. Documentation and artifacts. Scrum does not require a lot of artifacts, and documentation, product documentation, is not required by Scrum. That does not mean that it is not important and that you do not deliver it. It's just that Scrum, the process, does not ask for it. What does Scrum ask for? Scrum needs a product backlog, which we talked about, a short list of things to do, which is an artifact that's often confused with documentation, but it's very likely not the whole documentation. I'll come back to that in a moment. So product backlog is one document, one artifact. The sprint backlog, the plan for one team for the next few weeks, for the next sprint, is another artifact. And then we have the product increment at the end. We have the next version, working version of our product, the third artifact that Scrum requests. That's really part of official Scrum. All of that is not documentation as we used to think about. What the, Roberto is asking about is probably about product documentation do we produce? Well, that's actually up to you. What do you need? You might be in a project that's very lightweight, that has a very short life cycle, and where not a whole lot of documentation is needed. We have a few help screens, demo and an installation guide. You're already good enough. That could be one end of the spectrum. Very little documentation needed. You could also be in a large-scale medical audited environment where the auditors request that you have design documentation and program documentation for every piece of code that you deliver, because otherwise they're just going to block you. They will not let your project go live because the medical world is a controlled environment. In both cases, the light version and the heavy version, all those documents that have to be delivered will go on what we call the definition of done. The definition of done is a list of things, artifacts that the team who is sprinting has to deliver. In a light version, there will be just that help screen and that installer guide beyond the definition of done. In the heavy environment, you will have design documents with certain standards on the definition of done. Auditing becomes one of the activities in a sprint, because otherwise we will not have a shippable product. So in short, it will vary by the project, by the product, and by the demands that your product owner is making. Do no more than is necessary. We often make the mistake to deliver documentation because we always did so. And nobody's checking who's really reading the documentation or who's using the documentation. So give it a check, talk with your auditors, but that's the principle there. Let's see, what else? Gerardo, and I hope I pronounce your names right, I'm so sorry. Could you talk a little bit more about the sprint plan? What should it contain? Varies. With new teams, the way I teach sprint planning to people who are new to Scrum, who've never done this before, I advise to do two things. Step one in sprint planning is to select the work, look at the backlog, look at the stories, talk with the product owner, select the stories that you feel confident you can deliver. You have the right people in the team, you have the right skills. Don't do too much work, do a reasonable amount of work. So selecting is step one that you would see in the sprint plan. Then talk with the team, and this is where the product owner has less of a role and the actual team members have most of the work to do. Talk with the team about how will you do this. Say you pick your story, a requirement that asks you to be able to pay for a bill with a Visa credit card. Then talk with the team, what do we have to do here? And somebody might say we have to build a pop-up window that will collect the 16-digit credit card number. It will have to collect the date that it's expiring, and we collect this and we collect that, and somebody will sign up to that work. Then the test might say, oh, but I have to test that you really reject invalid credit card numbers, and I have to test that if you don't have enough balance on your credit cards, that it will get rejected, and a whole bunch of testing to be done. Hey, there's another task. Then the tech writer might say, and I need to do the documentation. So it's all those activities that I typically see on a sprint plan. Each task with the name of who will do it, and that person gives it an estimate, how long will it take me to do that. So that's a very detailed sprint plan. As soon as your team gets better and better at the work, say they've just built that Visa credit card and they did American Express credit card, and here's yet another user story, and it's yet another credit card. They probably don't need to task it all out. They say, oh yeah, here's another credit card, this is something special for it. No, not really. Okay, then we'll just do it and we know how long it's going to take. So experienced teams a bit less detail in the sprint plan, new teams typically a lot more detail there. And I hope that answered your question there, Gerardo. I'm looking at the list of questions. What books or references do you recommend to start with Scrum? Let me see. I think you're best supported by books that talk about how to do Scrum. Mike Cohn has written some very good books on the topic. Succeeding with Agile is the latest one. He's got specific ones on writing requirements. He's got a specific one on estimating and planning. Those are definitely good. There are a few more of those. If you're looking at the background of Scrum, almost the theory, why does it work, then look at Ken Swaber's first book, the Black Book, on Agile Project Management with Scrum. Another question, I'm using Scrum for about 2 years. We have a teamwork very long in our experience. The code documentation was very important. Does Scrum talk about that kind of documentation? And that's what I just said. Scrum by itself does not. Scrum has had very few practices or even requirements or prescriptions for documentation. There are a number of regularly accepted practices which are taken from the extreme programming world that talk about documentation and about coding documentation. I'm not a programmer anymore. My joke is always that I was very good at writing COBOL code, but Java is all alien to me. So I cannot really talk about coding. That would just not be right. Do some research online, or if you are visiting us at the conference, then there are definitely people around who've done this hands-on, but do some research online looking at extreme programming practices. Those are the practices that work with coding techniques. How can you use tests to document your code, and all those questions. A follow-on question from here. So if I don't have documentation, how do I do the feature maintenance? Well, that prompts a counter question. Have you ever asked your maintenance programmers whether they look at the documentation? What is an often perceived problem with documentation is that it is not maintained. We do build that credit card functionality, and then something changes within Visa, and we make an update, but the documentation is never updated. So all too often, the programmers doing maintenance work and the testers doing maintenance work say, yeah, the documentation is just out of date. And so inline code documentation is more used there. Tests to document the code is very helpful. Because think about it. If you change your feature, you have to change your tests. Otherwise, you get failing tests. So think more about producing test cases and documenting test cases to document your system, because you're forced to change your test cases if you change your system. Yet, I agree with Roberto that if you do have maintenance to do, that there is documentation necessary. Again, go back to the extreme programming practices to get a more detailed answer here. I'm just not enough of a developer anymore. Another question from Ricardo: what kind of contracts should be used in Scrum projects? Oh my gosh, do you have another couple of hours? That's a big question. It is not classic contract, because a classic contract, outsourcing contract, will talk about an amount of work, a certain scope, and that scope of work is delivered in a number of weeks or months or years, and if it's delivered successfully, the bill is paid. Agile contracts struggle with that because you work with a variable scope. Your product backlog, your requirements can change all the time. And there's a lot of work done around this topic, and I'm going to use that last slide of mine to type up a name, because spelling out over a voice link is hard. It's actually a popular topic here at the conference at the moment. If you do a search for this person, Gabrielle Benefield, she is developing support. She's developing content for this topic on how to develop agile contracts, and is launching a website today, tomorrow. It's one of the announcements at the conference over here, called flexiblecontracts.com, which is supporting and giving you examples of those Scrum contracts. It's all open source, it's all shareable, it's all free to use for you. Have a look there. And I hope that helps you with your question. And I see that I'm getting a ping from Karen that it's time to close the session. I hope, despite all the technical problems, that I was able to do something for you and answer some questions, give up what's going to happen at Agile Mexico conference. And Karen, I don't know whether you want to have a few closing words. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and I hope to meet you in Mexico.
Thank you, Hubert, for your presentation.
Okay, glad I could do that for you.
Gracias a todos los que participaron en el webinar. Sabemos que faltaron muchas preguntas. Por favor, nos las pueden enviar ya sea directamente a Hubert o al correo que les estoy colocando en el chat. Y como bien lo dice Hubert, los esperamos en nuestro evento de septiembre. Les copio la liga para que vean más información del evento y esperamos verlos pronto, verlos la próxima semana en el webinar de Scott Ambler. Muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos el próximo miércoles.